Hello, everyone, and welcome to Open Observability Talks. I'm your host, Dotan Horvitz, and here at Open Observability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. So may the open source be with you. And today we have a special episode. In a recent episode, we covered the rise of ClickHouse as an analytic database store. We discussed its design, choices, actually enables it to be very outstanding in its performance, as you might have heard. And we covered the use cases across multiple use cases from finance, e-commerce, marketing, and of course, observability. And my guest Robert shared back then how prominent the observability use case is among ClickHouse deployments. So now ClickHouse is actually doubling down on observability. Hot news earlier this year, ClickHouse Inc., the company behind the project, acquired HyperDX, a startup that implements observability on top of ClickHouse. And essentially, they built, it's based on OpenTelemetry and obviously ClickHouse itself, the database, for a full observability stack named ClickStack, and offering more complete open observability solution. So Open Observability Talks, that's a perfect stage. And I invited Mike Shi, the co-founder of HyperDX and co-creator of ClickStack, to tell us all about this new project. Mike is head of observability at ClickHouse, and he brings a prior observability experience with Elasticsearch and more. So it's definitely going to be a fascinating discussion. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining me.
Hello. So great to be here. Really excited.
Yeah. Where are you joining us from?
Yeah, I'm in my home down here in Mountain View, California. So right in the Bay Area.
Sounds good. So really exciting story. I gave the audience the gist of it, but really interesting to hear why you even started HyperDX and maybe why you chose ClickHouse for your startup.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's a really fun one. So, why do we start HyperDX? So, fun fact: this actually wasn't our initial product idea. Like many other startups, we were working on something tangential, also in developer tools, also kind of observability as well, actually. And we were facing this issue where every time we deploy our software for a new customer, we run into issues, like technical issues that we had to solve for them to start, paying us. And this happened over and over again. And we were using all sorts of observability tools. I come from an observability tool background, so I know a lot of the vendors that exist in the space. We were using a ton of them. And we couldn't get the insight we needed. It still took so long to get to the root cause of any specific issue. And at some point, we just started building it for ourselves. HyperDX was initially kind of just internally just for us. We wanted to build something that worked really well for ourselves. And then over time, we kept building. We showed it to a few other folks in the YC community, Y Combinator, which was an accelerator we're part of. They were really excited by the idea as well. It helped them solve problems a lot faster. And then we kind of kept going down, developing. Eventually, we did our open source launch. And then a lot of people, I think, were excited about the idea and the concept behind it. And to talk about the Elasticsearch part versus ClickHouse, maybe. So come from a product that was Elastic based in the past, and then when building HyperDX, had a choice of like what's the backend storage that I want to use, right? It's a really important question for any observability product. And ClickHouse just seemed like it had all the right knobs for a builder to tune to build the perfect, like kind of whatever perfect means to you as observability builder, right? You could choose between your compression, you could choose kind of the storage layout, tuning all different indices, how storage versus compute trade-offs. It had all sorts of really great tools, and the underlying technology was just really well suited for observability because it was built for clickstream data, right? Observability data almost effectively. So that's kind of why I went down that path and kind of how we even built the product to begin with.
Interesting. And you mentioned that it's from the get-go, obviously once you decided, you shifted, you pivoted and decided this is your main business, you decided from the get-go to make it open source, right? This is part of
Yes.
your strategy. Curious as a founder, as an entrepreneur, why you chose the open source path for this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from when I think one of the joys of building your own company is that you get to stamp kind of your own opinions on how things are done. And me personally, I've always been a huge fan of open source software, right? I think as a developer, you kind of have to be, when you get started developing the tools, everything you use is open source. And in fact, even, we chose a license, MIT license, which is maybe even, stronger open source than some of the other ones. Not by a lot, but definitely a nice kind of open source license. And it's largely because, me and my co-founder Warren, we have such strong roots in using open source software so successfully, and everything I love to use is open source as well. That's one of the personal reasons. As for kind of maybe our product reasons as well, open source allows users to use your product without having to talk to a salesperson, right? Like, I'm not a professional salesperson. I come from a technical background, a product background. As much as I love talking to users, I'm not the professional salesperson. But open source kind of lets people use a product, see if it works for them. And if there's a world where like, hey, I want, part of this product, but maybe commercially support in some way, it's a really easy conversation. I don't have to go and, sell them on kind of why they should be using, ClickStack or HyperDX or whatnot. They've already used it, loved it. And we just show that our product is the best because of open source. And then, hopefully that transitions into a commercial relationship in the future if it works out for them. So I thought that was a really awesome fit for our skills and backgrounds and interests as well.
And it worked out nicely with the acquisition afterwards, because the company that you were acquired by, ClickHouse Inc., obviously is roots also very centered within open source. So the synergy on that regard was very evident. But I'm just curious, before we move on to the technicalities, because I have this conversation day in and day out with young entrepreneurs about whether going down the open source path or not. With your, thought process cycles, ideation, maybe even talking to other entrepreneurs in YC and whatnot, what would be like your key considerations? Because obviously there is no clear cut. Each one needs to do his own math. But what would be your like three top? Ask yourself these questions to figure out what's right for you.
Yeah. So I'm assuming it's like, you think about, hey, should I open source or not, right? And I would say for sure I think there's definitely a lot of nuance to this, right? I think open source works extremely well for a specific type of product, which tends to be like a technical product, right? For example, if your buyer is completely non-technical, it might not make a huge difference to them whether it's open source or not, because they don't get to take advantage of contributing back or self-hosting it. It's a lot harder for them to, take advantage of the open source nature of your product at the end of the day. So I think that's one big one is like, hey, is your audience largely technical or not? It doesn't have to be engineers, but folks who are comfortable with the idea of self-hosting, right? That's a huge advantage of open source, or like the idea of maybe being able to contribute or run the software on their own. That's a big one. I think the other one as well really lies around, are you also kind of like comfortable with the idea? Are you also comfortable with the idea of having competition, right? To the other extent as well. When you create something that's open source, the biggest fear, of course, is that someone can take your code and then run it, right? I think that's happened a bit in the industry, unfortunately, as well. And are you comfortable with that idea as a founder? I think for us is like, hey, like we believe in our ability to execute as a product and be able to, even if it's hard fork somewhere else, that we'll continue to build a product that does really well in that regards, and having that self-belief. And I think the third thing is what I mentioned earlier is, hey, like, do you think that you want to be selling to these people in a more kind of traditional sales manner, right? Open source is a whole new different way of having people try your software, and that introduces a whole different commercial aspect to it as your startup. And if you think you're maybe if you think you're great at sales, maybe you don't need open source. You don't want to do open source, right? You're probably not comfortable with it as well. But if maybe you come from technical background or product background, you want your product to be the thing that kind of sells the user. I think open source is a great channel for that.
Yeah, it's a sort of a product-led growth that obviously exists also outside of open source, but definitely open source lends itself very well to PLG, to product-led growth. So it's a very very good point to think what your skill sets are and where you want to grow them. So it's a good tip.
And then
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna say like one thing I actually totally forgot that's I think super important as well is that open source, another benefit of open source is kind of the community as well, right? A big part of what makes us successful is we get all this really great feedback and even contributions from folks who have different use cases that we could not possibly be building all of those in-house. And I think that's, again, another one where it's like, hey, you have a really complex product with a lot of different use cases you need to satisfy. Again, open source helps because there's a community, which you have to invest into, of course, but they will kind of, help you back as well. And I think that's a really great part of building in the open.
Yeah, no, it's for me that's like the number one, because you really get the force multiplier on the innovation around the product that you can never do with your headcount. Even if you're much bigger than a startup, it's still when you get the community, like, I don't know, think about Prometheus or also ClickHouse, I think is today very mature in terms of that. So you get this diversity and innovation that comes from direction that you wouldn't even expect. So that's amazing.
Exactly.
And so let's go back to the to what you've done. So you talked about the origins of HyperDX, and just to summarize, essentially you took the backend based on, and you started sharing about the decisions of using ClickHouse as the foundation, the backend, and you created essentially the front end experience, the visualization experience, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great, like, maybe simplification of the product for sure. Yeah.
So no, actually, I want you to guide us.
Oh,
Obviously,
yeah.
it has a lot of aspects, from searching to sharding to alerting to whatnot. So give us this experience that you were trying to see, and also actually mapping out or starting detailing these gaps that you couldn't actually find, you said, out there with the existing tool set.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for us, it's all about how do we go from a problem an engineer is facing to the clues that they need to find that root cause, right, at the end of the day. And that's really kind of the journey that we think about the most from the beginning. I think this is actually really different from a lot of the other tools that uh, we've used in the past, because they all think about, I think, a bit about, hey, like, it's a logging product, or hey, like, it's a tracing product, or hey, it's a metrics product. It's really signal kind of like centric, versus for us, it's very intentional that you don't see a logging part of the app. Like, there's no like logs and metrics and APM or traces kind of part of the application. And that's really intentional, because we think that, hey, like, we want you to think about, hey, are you searching for something, right? So we have like a search experience. You go in, you could type, and you could actually, easily search across logs and traces in the same, simple syntax. At the end of the day, once you find one of those data points, it'll be automatically via the power of OTel, of course, right? If you have your logs correlated to traces, you'll have this wonderful waterfall that includes both your traces and your logs embedded in the same UI. And then it's also correlatable with, your session replay as well, right? So going from, usually when you're building a web-based application, you'll have a user, they'll be, have some user identifier. They might talk about, hey, I'm running into some issue, can you help me out? It's really easy to go find in that, specific user identifier, view what they were doing to repro the steps, be able to find like, oh, that was that specific API call, that 500, click into that API call, that 500, go into the backend and see, the backend traces and the logs associated with it, and then be able to say, like, that's the part of the application that failed for this specific user. I can now go back and, solve for that, right? And that's really kind of been like the kernel of the problem that we've been solving. And of course, over time, we're, building more and more things like, hey, like, how do we connect to the infrastructure? How do we make sure like the pod is healthy? The pod hasn't been, rapidly restarting or running into some sort of memory pressure or whatnot. And we're kind of solving more and more problems over time. But that's kind of been like the kernel of the experience we built from day one.
So maybe just to make sure that you understand. So we talked about a unified experience across different signals, and also you mentioned already things that are more, let's say, client side, from the client side interaction, starting with a session replay is a very good example of observability on the client side, all the way to the back end and so on. So what, if you try to detail that, what elements of this observability, maybe other signals that you incorporate, for example, profiles or others, give us the full gist of what goes into this unified observability.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think it's, it is still, at the end of the day, like, the signals will be, is RUM a signal? I'm not too sure. Like, client side tracing and logging, what do you call that? RUM. You have your sessions, so that's kind of like DOM snapshots and deltas, right? As well, you have your traditional, backend logs, your traditional spans, your traditional metrics as well. And do you count exceptions as their own signal, or are they really just span events? I think there's a lot of, admittedly, I think there's a lot of blur between these. I understand kind of from one perspective why they have different names, but on the other hand, they're also kind of like, hey, they're all events. I think, definitely subscribe to that train of thought as well.
Yeah, which I guess also lends itself well to the nature of the underlying storage, which in your
Right.
case is ClickHouse, obviously, because it's a columnar data store in essence. So, wide events is something that it's, by the way, something that I've been discussing here on the show for already in the past. We've heard that also from Honeycomb. I had the charity majors here with me on the episode concluding 2024, and one of the things, obviously, that we talked about is this topic as well. So it is something that I see keep on coming up in discussions. It has obviously its benefits of being able to uniformly put all the types of signals in one, I guess, wide event in a way, in a
Yep.
sense. Obviously, it has also its drawbacks, but I definitely see where it's coming from, and there is also the tieback to mapping that to the backend storage. But I'm curious. So HyperDX brought this value add, and we're now leading up to ClickStack, which is essentially the new stack for ClickHouse combined with HyperDX and OpenTelemetry and so on. But let me ask a step before that, because people have been using ClickHouse for observability for quite some time now. We talked about it in the previous episode that I mentioned already with some names, and I had on my show here actually a gentleman from Shopify is Elijah McPherson. He's an engineering director of real-time storage systems, who shared how Shopify rebuilt their observability from the ground up in-house. They actually tore out vendors and built it homegrown. And one of the pieces of this very, very pretty stack that they brought up is ClickHouse. So the question is, and I'll share, by the way, the link with the listeners on the show notes, so you should listen to that, the fascinating episode. So Shopify took this ClickHouse and built their own observability. Why can't every organization essentially do that? Why would not build directly on top of ClickHouse?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, there's a lot of teams that definitely do that, right? In fact, it was, I think, a week or two ago, we were at the Netflix office, and they were talking about their, logging platform built on top of ClickHouse as well, which is always fantastic to see about. I think the challenge there is that it's certainly a lot of engineering effort to turn a database into an observability platform. It's certainly, ClickHouse has made it a lot easier, and it's definitely, I'm biased obviously, but I think it is the best data store for the problem currently. There's obviously edge cases and all that, but I think it is a really great platform to build on top of. But the reality is that there's still some difficulty going from a data store into a whole observability platform. There's things like tuning your indices, tuning your schema, building something that also optimizes the searches as much as possible, and also creates an experience that the users are used to, right? Even simple things like, hey, like, how do we make sure we have good autocomplete? Those don't come out of the box with ClickHouse. ClickHouse is a really great database, but doesn't have, like, field value autocomplete out of the box. So you have to create your queries and think about how do you optimize that and create a really low latency, fast experience for our users. And then also piecing together the workflows and all that. So there's a bit of investment that goes into it. There's certainly teams that do go down a route, and that's absolutely fantastic. And there's other teams who, they have engineers who might not be able to, put in the Shopify spent a lot of time building, I think, their platform. They talked about that themselves as well. So I think there's not every company has the ability to invest into that. Some people just need hey, we just need a product that'll just work out of the box. Maybe we'll have some stuff on our end, but it isn't, a huge investment of custom engineering on top.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think on a previous discussion that we had, you emphasized that the smaller companies, small, even medium companies that don't have the luxury of putting this amount of headcount and expertise, skill set to really maintain your own. And they need something simpler and something more readily available. So I think this is, but although, some large corporates still, in terms of the IT skills, I know they're big as a company, but they prefer to have something that is more readily available and not put the investment there. So I think it makes perfect sense. Which leads us to now the current thing. So give us the elevator pitch on ClickStack. as you present it, as you view it today?
Yeah, I mean, ClickStack, just the short pitch is that it's a open source, high performance observability platform, and it's built on top of ClickHouse, right? And that's kind of the short story of it. I think if you go deep into it, it's a lot about talking about how we're building a really, engineering focused experience, a really focused experience around solving, as I was talking about earlier, how do we how do we present the clues? How do we help you basically surface the data that you need to go from that incident or that bug to that root cause at the end of the day? And a lot of love and effort goes into making sure that's a smooth path as opposed to maybe a signals focused path as part of the pitch.
And I think if we go a step further, and our audience is very familiar with the observability stack. So the pieces, if we break it down, is obviously the HyperDX, the front end, very intelligent front end that you've put together as part of your startup, HyperDX. ClickHouse, that we've been talking about, the performant data store. And then there's OpenTelemetry, right?
Yep.
As the third piece of this puzzle. So
Exactly.
can you tell us a bit about this part? And also, you've made the choice for OpenTelemetry also already in HyperDX, right? So
Yes.
this is something that you've done early on. So maybe by now, when we talk about that in 2025, when we record it, OTel is already fairly established, and it will be less of a question. But I'm actually curious, going back then, what made you choose OTel? Maybe what kinds of dilemmas or debates did you have in going down this path? If you can share with us about OTel back in the day, rewind to that decision point.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think OpenTelemetry is such a game changer in the observability space, right? And there's a reason why all the folks that we talk to, whether it's users or vendors, right, we're all talking about OpenTelemetry at the end of the day. Now, when I made the decision many years ago at this point to kind of invest heavily into OpenTelemetry, the project was definitely a bit younger, not as young as when I first remember the merge between the projects, but still quite early
That's
on.
open tracing and open census for those who don't know, which merge so essentially OpenTelemetry, for our audience, just to know, is started as a merge of two other open source projects or standards, specifications that preceded it. So that's back to the old days.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then, it's quite a new project from that regards, but of course, open census and open tracing, that have had great work before as well. Now, when we made that decision, I think there was a number of reasons to go down that path. One is that open source and standards really go hand in hand, right? The more that we can kind of take advantage of standards that everyone is moving towards, the stronger the ecosystem becomes. And certainly, we wanted to be a great player in the ecosystem. And of course, the reason we build this tooling is also, of course, providing another way to do observability in the OpenTelemetry ecosystem, right? And as a builder as well, it creates a lot of standardization that, frankly, we don't want to be in the business of thinking about, right? We don't want to create our own semantic convention. We don't want to think about, hey, like, how do we name these different properties? To some extent, the community being able to coalesce around these set of standards makes it really easy for us to know, how do I know what's the, pod ID? Like, hey, like, it's under k, it's pod ID, right? So those semantic conventions makes it really powerful, because when we talk about the story of unifying telemetry, OpenTelemetry is kind of, being able to help unlock a lot of that, right? From the semantic convention, so that we know, hey, this log, when it references this case pod ID versus this metric versus this trace, we know that those are all referring to the same exact ID. And the other part is, of course, the API, the SDK API, right? Allowing you to, merge between your logs and your metrics and your traces, because it's all being emitted through the same SDK. It has the same context. There's a lot of power behind what they built in OpenTelemetry. Of course, I think there's been detractors over the years as well. I think there's definitely areas where the project continues to improve, but it's honestly amazing in terms of what it's unlocked, and I think that's why everyone across industries, adopting it. It's just kind of a net gain when everyone kind of builds into this ecosystem.
Yeah, and I really, you said that, I would say even more. I think the real power of open source starts with the open specifications and the open standards. I think that, and I've been working for teams and groups and even vendors that had open source tools, but I think really having this common language, common specification is something very, very powerful to bring us together. Also to simplify for the vendors, as you said, because also as a vendor, think about all the number of integrations that the old school APMs needed to maintain, the dyna traces of the worlds, the app dynamics, and these armies of engineers just to maintain all the variety of, okay, when I collect the telemetry from I don't know, from Kafka, and when I collect it from Redis and from Apache and from this, each one has its own spec, and you need to support everything because you want to be universal. Especially in observability, that's the point. You're the nexus point where you show everything, and when you have the standard, it simplifies. So I definitely see, and it's actually just today on the post I posted on LinkedIn how at OpenTelemetry, and I'm as a CNCF ambassador, I'm a passionate ambassador of OpenTelemetry as well, announcing the RPC Semantic Convention Stabilization Project, and I shared how happy I am finally, whether gRPC or JSON RPC or Apache Dubo or whatnot. So the goal is to actually have one unified semantic conventions, one lingua franca for across all these things. So really happy to see, and great work, by the way, by the semantic convention SIG, the special interest group. So this is definitely something that I look into day in and day out. I myself am a co-lead of the semantic conventions for the CI/CD side of the house, which is also talking about the release pipelines, not just the production monitoring. So there's so much to do to tackle. We're now looking into tagging resources. Like how do you tag the resources to say that this is an environment, this is the prod environment or the dev environment, and this is so today you have like the cloud vendor specific terminology that they put. But then again, if you work multi-cloud, then you need to start translating, and it doesn't necessarily translate well, and so on. So this is another tag, technical advisory group that are looking to propose to tackle this one as well. So there's so much to be done, but I think this is really the power of things. And maybe another anecdote just from Open Observability Summit, the first Open Observability Summit that we had as part of the CNCF, just took place June in Denver, was one of the keynotes, which was actually a keynote speaker from Datadog, a vendor, well-established vendor in the monitoring and observability space. That was a sponsored keynote, and the choice that they made on the topic was the power of semantic conventions. And I was really, really happy to see that. I said, okay, if this is what they chose to spend their time on, this just goes to show how universal it is today, also amongst vendors that used to make a lot of money out of exactly that, these agents and all this intelligence there, and invested a lot of engineering effort around that, realizing that. And that was a director of engineering, someone definitely as a weight to what he is saying. It was really, really amazing to see that, and it echoed well with the audience there, of course. So you said something very important here that I believe that you've done the right step. But maybe fast forwarding to today, when you see that, so where do you see, from your perspective, OpenTelemetry, both as someone building on top of, integrating it into your product, including also the gaps still that you see where you would like to see the project improving or taking additional directions? Curious to have your expert view on OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, another advantage of OpenTelemetry we didn't talk about yet is that it gives users the option of choosing vendors, right? We've moved to a world where users instrument first with OpenTelemetry, and then they get a pick, like, hey, I'm going to go bake off your product with 3 other vendors, right? And at the end of the day, that just means that the user gets hopefully the best option, because they get to try everything on equal footing, right? With OpenTelemetry, there's no excuse like, oh, it's a different agent or whatnot. Like, it's the same data, it's the same semantic conventions, it's the same payloads being sent out to these different vendors, and it's just about like, hey, how well does it work for their use case, and gives them a lot of options. On our end, when it comes to the work with OpenTelemetry, I think a lot of it is, of course, there's a big part of us maintaining the OpenTelemetry export into ClickHouse. There's certainly always kind of like thoughts in our head. It's like, hey, how do we make this process more efficient, right? On the ingestion side alone, writing bytes into a database isn't free. Kind of processing and filtering isn't free, right? So there's definitely a bit of work that we want to continue improving on there. And then, it also ties into some of the changes to data store level. We haven't talked about JSON yet. Maybe we'll do a later in the segment, but there's a lot of changes needed to support a new data type, right? And I think there's some interesting work around. There's a lot of interesting work in the ecosystem around, like columnar storage formats or columnar serialization formats of telemetry data in the OpenTelemetry ecosystem as well, which is also a very interesting part that we want to keep on top of. I think as a vendor building in the space, one of the areas that we want to help kind of contribute to the ecosystem is continue improving the ease of use and the ease of adoption of OpenTelemetry. I think that's probably one of the trickiest parts today, is that going from not knowing much about OpenTelemetry into having it fully instrumented still takes a decent amount of knowledge and learning. And it's not as, I think, easy as some of the folks might want, right? I think that's kind of been reflected in both the surveys, like, hey, documentation can always be improved. That's with every tool that's complex, of course. But, I think, it's maybe objectively at this point, we've seen like, hey, lots of folks find areas of documentation. And of course, every month when I go back, it has gotten better. And that's really fantastic. And we're looking forward to hopefully be able to contribute to that as well. And then also, of course, on the installation side, it's also gotten better every single year. There's always a new, better way to auto instrument or to bring in your data or to simplify the SDK installation process. But of course, there's still steps to go as well. So we want to make it sure that's even easier to adopt OpenTelemetry as an organization, and then gives them the flexibility to then choose, hey, what's the best product for them? And hopefully, it's what we're building and what we've been spending our time on as well.
Yeah, definitely resonates, and a lot of work is being done to be to complement the folks who are doing that, including, but there are also localization, translation. There's such a big audience out there that is not native English speaker, so making it accessible to that audience as well. And there's so much, but yeah, it's such a massive project that covering all and also moving fast enough with the progress of innovation. That's a challenge. And calling on our listeners, if you are passionate in one of the areas of OTel and you see gaps and you feel that you can contribute even in documentation fixing or even opening issues on things like that'd be amazing. So contribution doesn't have to be code, could even be with documentation. It's actually a good way for maybe newer folks to open source to get dip their toes in open source. So that's a good starting point. Another thing that is interesting, you told me about the shift that you did, like in the original, let's say V1 of the product, the product approach was more like abstracting the underlying ClickHouse and to give sort of more sterile experience, whereas now you've reached sort of a different approach or a conclusion that something a bit deeper, that the underlying database being more accessible has its own benefits. Do you want to talk about this a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things as an observability product, as I was kind of mentioned earlier, observability is a field where there's all sorts of different use cases, right? Some folks aren't even observing software; they're observing hardware, right? Things that run on the streets or in a factory, and all those different use cases end up having their specialized needs, their specialized questions, their specialized workflows that one tool probably can't be the best fit for from the very beginning. And that's kind of the one things that we ran into, is that we talked to more and more people and had more and more use cases. Eventually there were, we had to like, hey, there's all these different features we have to build. Maybe one big one would be, hey, how do we do on the fly parsing, right? Like I, wrote a unstructured event, maybe it's a log, right? And I need to now regex out some information and do some charting and aggregation on top of that. That's something for if we were to continue abstracting the database, it's another feature we'd have to build, and quite a big complex one at that. Versus when you're building on top of a powerful data store, like ClickHouse supports SQL. A lot of folks already know SQL. It's really well documented, and it's extremely flexible too. You could write whole programs. In fact, one of our colleagues on our team wrote an entire RISC-V emulator in ClickHouse SQL. So it really shows you how maybe complete the language is. And that kind of goes to shows like, why are we spending so much work abstracting away a database when in fact, one of the superpowers is that you can query the database directly. If you need to go down to SQL, we should let users do that and be able to do that safely on top of ClickHouse. And that's kind of one of the big revelations that we've made, that we don't need to build a super complex product with a specialized feature for every single use case. if we give them the flexibility of SQL is like, hey, when you have a difficult problem, you can break down a SQL, use that language that you're probably already familiar with, and then get the data you need, as opposed to waiting for us or you having to implement your own feature in open source and submitting a PR that way. So that was kind of the big shift that that led us in that direction.
Which I think also relates maybe to, and I used to be a product manager in past life, so it really resonates with me, because there's also always this debate whether it should be yet another UI experience, like visualization, something to do with a point and click and things like that, or whether you should be more, in this case, like querying, just write your query and investigate your data in that manner. So like visualization versus querying the data, what's the best way? And actually, there is no one best way, as you said. It depends on the use case. It depends also on the persona. There may be someone who's more versed with the SQL will feel more natural actually querying the data, and it will be more cumbersome for them to do the visualization. Whereas someone who's not familiar, actually, the point and click will be the easier experience. So you need to cater for the novice, the versed. It's very difficult to get one platform to fit them all, as you said. So that's an interesting. And also you mentioned SQL. That brings another interesting question, because ClickHouse is known for this, I guess, strategic choice of aligning with SQL, which is a whole different debate out there among the storage engines. What's the right thing? But you brought, zooming into ClickHouse, so one of the novelties that you brought with you from HyperDX is actually also the Lucene side of the house. So now users can have the Lucene search experience. Lucene, for those who don't know, this is the native language from the project Apache Lucene, and also people know it from Solar and Elasticsearch and OpenSearch and other projects that are built on that. So today you provide both experiences, right? So there's the SQL analytics experience and the Lucene search experience. Can you tell us a bit why Lucene, why SQL, maybe how you see them, like what's the best practice that you'd recommend and guide users on that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're totally right. We chose and that's one of the things you were mentioning earlier is like, there's no right answer between having a nice, easy use visual experience versus a power user kind of, more of a bare metal maybe experience. In this case, that'd be SQL. But talking about our choice into using Lucene, that's kind of one of the things that we want to do is that, admittedly, there are times where Lucene is just going to be a lot faster, right? And it's also a higher level language than SQL, realistically speaking, as well. So for example, in Lucene, you can just type in the word error, right? You can type in the word error, hit enter, and you'll get your error logs. SQL, you can't type in the word error, hit enter, and then get your error logs. It's a little bit more verbose than that, right? But then also one of the benefits is that when you type in this higher level language, we can make actually some optimizations under the hood. When you do type in the word error, it's like, hey, we're going to do a token search by default. We're not going to do a substring search, right? Most people who are using SQL, they're probably used to typing like or I like and then doing the percent, word percent, and that's a substring search. That's a bit more. That's actually quite a bit more expensive, depending on how you, build your database compared to a token search, which you can tokenize and build some indices on top of that ahead of time. So it gives users a higher level language to really easily start. And also it gives us the ability to help optimize for the user their specific for the observability use case, right? The other thing too is that I think everyone uses Lucene syntax. If you're using Google, you're more or less using a similar, not exact, right? Admittedly, ours is also a Lucene-like syntax. It's not completely to the language. But if you're using Google, it's also a very similar experience using already. So basically, everyone who's used Google, you're probably going to be comfortable using, Lucene syntax, and therefore hopefully comfortable using what we built with HyperDX as well.
Nice. Another element that is very relevant, it's very prominent in ClickHouse, and again, we talked about it in the previous episode a lot, is performance. Performance is central to ClickHouse. Look like it's, design choice number 0.
Yes.
Feature number 0, and it's very, very clear. And obviously, this is why most people that hear about ClickHouse first hear about this in this context, which is great. And the question is, in the context of observability, you've done significant work as well, focusing squarely on performance in the observability side. Can you share a bit about that side?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say maybe zooming out, observability, why ClickHouse is so good at performance for observability in general, right? And I would say that it's because observability, and why is ClickHouse now like this kind of big name where a lot of vendors are using it. I would say it's because like observability has kind of shifted its problem statement over time, right? Well, I think we also shifted the word over time. You go from like log management to monitoring, and then observability and all that. I won't get into that right now, but basically we've kind of as systems got more complex, as we're collecting more data, it turns out be able to understand trends, right, and be able to have a high level view of a complex system is a lot more important than shelling into one VM and then tailing the log from that specific VM, right? So we kind of changed how we view the problem of reliability on these kind of systems, and therefore, as you're trying to get a higher level view, it turns out, going for individual events is a little less relevant, and being able to, aggregate across, millions or billions of events becomes a lot more pertinent to the problem. And ClickHouse has kind of been born from that mindset, right? How do we analyze billions of events and build aggregations on top of it for analytics purposes? And observability has kind of converged into that problem set. So ClickHouse itself has already been really powerful. It's because it's a columnar database to start with. So instead of having to scan, usually if you emit a wide event, you're not looking for every single property of that event, right? Maybe it's like, hey, I'm filtering by the user ID, by this specific region, maybe by this pod identifier, right? So you're only pulling out specific subsets of the data, and the columnar layout allows you to query that really efficiently. You're only querying a subset of data that you need. And then ClickHouse, of course, under the hood, as you mentioned, performance has been kind of the hallmark trait of it. And there's a ton of I'm not a database expert, I'm from the observability side, right? But there's a ton of optimizations being made into being able to leverage the specific CPU architectures, or the vectorization or the SIMD abilities of those CPUs to be able to process batches of data at once, right, in parallel, as opposed to processing event by event. And that, of course, leads to speedups as well. So data store, really well built for it. And then it's about how do we make sure it works really well for the observability use case, right? And that's about how do we tune the right schemas? How do we make sure that the right data is cached at the right layers? It has great things like, you could separate your data that sits on NVMe versus data that sits on S3, which, really popular is storing data on S3 these days, or your, object storage of choice from your cloud vendor, right? You can kind of split that with ClickHouse. You can choose, what indices you want to build, how much storage do you want to build for that specific index. The tokens that we talked about before, you want to build a token index, but you only want them to be a certain size of a certain, number of hash functions for the Bloom filter. There's a lot of different things that we tune, and there's also still more improvements actually coming along in the pipeline. There's still kind of more optimizations and more clever ways we think about how to make it more and more efficient for specific observability that hopefully we're excited to share as well. I'm happy to talk about that all day, but maybe that's a good enough high level overview.
No, you gave us a very good one, and I think you talked about the things that are coming up. One of the things that caught my eye was the JSON that you alluded to earlier on, and I think first this is a classic move, and I think a very clever move in terms of performance, and also one that answered, or hopefully I haven't tried it myself to testify, but at least the mission statement is one that I found with regards I mentioned to that popularization of the columnar wide event approach, that the advantages are clear, everything you stated, that everything is together, then you query only the relevant subset. But I've seen at least also implications in performance. In performance, in typing, and so on. And one of the things that I was curious back in the day when I saw different vendors and different projects going down this path is how do you address that? And I think one of the smart moves you've made with a JSON type addresses that. So I'm actually curious for you to share with the audience a bit more about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the JSON type, for folks that don't know, it basically is trying to solve the problem of, your logs, your tracer, your telemetry data is effectively, even if it's, you structure it in JSON or whatnot, right? It's going to be semi-structured and have new properties pop up, and, properties won't exist in every single event. And in a columnar database, in a rigid columnar, maybe a traditional columnar database, you'd have to define a column per property, more or less, right? So if you have, properties that show up one in a billion events, you're going to have a column that's not used very often, which isn't fantastic from a performance perspective. Now, there were, ClickHouse, the JSON wasn't the only way to store these kind of dynamic properties. We had something called a map type, but the performance was more or less linear. As in, the more properties you add to it, the longer it will take for us to scan through that column. The JSON type basically adds some more intelligence in a database into knowing about sparse properties. So basically, if you have, maybe like you have like 5,000 properties, but maybe most of them don't exist for every single event. What we'll do is like, hey, for the most common properties you could choose as a setting, either 1,000 or 100, whatever properties, those get turned into actual columns. And the ClickHouse will actually try to figure out, hey, what properties make the most sense to turn into a column by viewing, hey, does this property exist a lot, right? If it exists a lot, it should be turned into a column. If it doesn't, it will actually be stored into one shared column. So you aren't, creating millions of columns. You have millions of properties. All those different, like long tail columns get put into their own little column. It's still performant. It still has some performance benefits to it, but it is not going to be as performant as its own column, of course. But if it is a very common property, it'll be put in its own column, take advantage of the columnar nature and parallel processing and higher compression rates, etc. And I think I did a demo was a week back where I think it was like maybe like 10x faster basic searches and maybe like 100x less data scanned, because you're only scanning for that one property as opposed to maybe the batch of properties that you have to scan before.
Nice. And also in terms of the typing, right? Because essentially, it's not everything is a string, and then you go into additional both performance and also accuracy with the conversions rather than having the native type.
Exactly. So if you submitted, for example, a uint64, like it will be stored as a uint64. It won't be in64 and overflow or stored as a string where they cast it back. It is stored natively as a uint64, and that will of course take advantage of the fact that with the in64, it's a lot easier for a CPU to process that as a native data type than deserializing a string and all that. So there's a ton of different benefits, and also property collision. You don't have to worry about property collision. You have two properties with different types. You don't have to worry about it, colliding at the schema level. They'll be kept into their own subtypes and all sorts of stuff like that.
Folks who've been running like you and me with Elasticsearch and the likes probably know it.
The mapping collision.
Suddenly comes this one document that has the same field, but that's a different type. Okay, go figure out how to handle this one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Another challenge that we've all been facing, both as end users, as project maintainers, as vendors, is with the time series, with the cardinality. We see that today, with all the levels of virtualization and Kubernetes and microservices and pods and whatnot, each one has its own dimensions and so on. So, and it's been each tool tackled that differently. Do you want to share how you address that within ClickStack?
Yeah, absolutely. So cardinality is certainly a problem for, maybe like the traditional time series database where you create, one time series per, label set, right? And then you have high cardinality. That means you have a lot of time series. That becomes a bit of an issue. Within ClickHouse, the storage format is actually more of, it really takes advantage of like the merge tree kind of structure that ClickHouse has. So instead of creating a separate time series or a separate time series, and that creates complexity in database, and creating different time series, instead it's one giant table, but the keys are separated by the label set effectively, right? So basically you have a really long table as opposed to maybe a crude analogy in other time series database, maybe having a lot of different tables, right? Not perfect. Those that know databases will probably cringe a bit when I say that, but that's kind of maybe the biggest difference. And the reason that we can still be performant in a really large table is because, one, ClickHouse is kind of built for really large tables to begin with. And second of all, because we can index into the part of the table that's relevant. So even if you have, millions or billions of time series, all that will do is basically just expand the size of the table, as opposed to building, managing a ton of overhead with having different time series that you need to track at the database level. So that's maybe the TLDR of how that all laid out.
Makes sense. And going back to the SQL nature again, SQL is a very, easy choice in terms of how widely spread it is and how easy it is. But originally it came from relational databases where it made sense, with the way that it's stored, normalized and so on. But then when you try to apply SQL to other data stores of sorts, then you come with challenges like I guess the classic is the join operation
Mhm.
that can be a pain. So maybe if you want to say a word about how you tackle that in your area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the reality is that, data that isn't being joined is always going to be more performant than data that is joined. So it is an area that, especially in observability, where we talk about wide events, like one of the advantages that it is denormalized, right? You'll have repetitive, the labels are going to be a bit repetitive, but because of that, you'll get that performance back. And I think most data stores kind of adopt that principle to begin with. Joins today are still a bit rare in observability. That being said, of course, because ClickHouse is a SQL database and does have the ability to do joins, and that there's a ton of progress that's been made by the core database team in improving that. And I think anyone who looks at the project has seen the progress being made there. Is that you can actually join that data, and I'm actually really excited for the future where people start taking advantage of this fact that hey, like I have some interesting business data. Like maybe I have my customer IDs mapped to some, business domain specific information that I want to query alongside our observability data. And I'm really excited that, now that we have a data store that can do both pretty well, and you can do the joins across those without having them denormalized and stored in the same place from day one, that we're going to unlock a lot of really exciting kind of use cases and answer a lot more questions that we weren't able to before. So I think that's some exciting stuff ahead that we can do that.
Yeah, that's exciting. The tooling allows us because I've been preaching the fact that observability is far bigger and greater than just the IT side of observability and into
Exactly.
product. Again, being a product manager, I found observability very insightful for me as a product manager to understand how my launch is performing and
Exactly.
to entrepreneurs that I've been working with, that how to understand how their business is going, how to structure their pricing model, and so much more. So I definitely with you on that. I do want to spend a bit of time in the time that is left to talk about how it's actually being put to use, the open source ClickStack out there, and there are big names. You actually just had a marvelous event for your community, the open house event, the first event, and then by the way, it looked very impressive from afar, for having followed the feedback from that. So sounded exciting, and I know that some very interesting use case came up with companies such as OpenAI, Anthropic, Tesla, whatnot. So really impressive companies that needed to solve their observability challenges and chose ClickStack as their go-to path, and then the ClickHouse, underlying ClickHouse for that end. So can you share with us maybe a bit of the experiences shared, putting it in production, running it at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the big underlining point of all the talks, as you mentioned, we were really fortunate to have, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Tesla all come live onto our event and talk about how they're using ClickHouse and leveraging the observability use case there. Um, and I think the underlying point for all of them was scale, right? I think Tesla was I think had the most interesting way of saying it. I think there was like 1 quintillion rows, I believe, stored in their ClickHouse instance. That's a result of going at 1 billion events per second, if I remember correctly there. So it's a testament to the amount of scale they're talking about. And I think OpenAI talked about how again, the open source nature. They were actually had a story about how they contributed back to ClickHouse and greatly reduced the CPU usage of inserting the petabytes of data that they were doing. As you imagine, ChatGPT generates a lot of events that need to keep track of, especially as they're every time they do a new product launch, their usage grows exponentially. So again, there's a lot of kind of talk about how it works at scale, and not only that it scales really well, but also, of course, it's cost effective. Any system, if you throw enough money at it, will probably continue scaling. But the big part was, I think, with Anthropic was basically talking about, like money is no longer on fire. When they moved to ClickHouse, whereas before it was effectively like they were just shoveling money into a coal pit and lighting it on fire. So I think that's kind of one of the big key takeaways. It scales really well, and it scales really cost effectively and lets these companies collect the telemetry they need to solve the problems that they need. I think Anthropic talked about how their latest versions of their models were made possible because they had ClickHouse power and their observability, so that they can, of course, diagnose and improve their systems based off their telemetry that they were collecting on top of it. So that was all really exciting to see, and also really exciting that we get to the public gets to hear about all the hard work that these teams have put into building these systems.
That's amazing, and I can definitely recommend the audience, our listeners, to check it out. I think all the recordings are on YouTube, so check them out. You can hear it straight from the engineers that implemented that in as you heard, OpenAI, Anthropic, Tesla. These are impressive companies, and learn from their experiences, and hear the other talks from the event. I think very impressive and interesting. And also maybe on this opportunity, can you tell the listeners where they can follow you, when they can follow the ClickStack project, how they can get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I think my Twitter handle is like Mike Shi 42, or LinkedIn as well. I think I'm pretty active on there. Overall, though, you can go check out both the projects on GitHub, HyperDX.io/HyperDX. Go search it on there. And then also we have ClickHouse.com/O11Y, so like short for observability. There you could read all about ClickStack documentation, getting started, and then links to the repos and contributing and all of that. So really excited to have more folks try it out, run in production, help give feedback, help contribute. We've been blessed with so many contributors after our launch as well, and all this kind of excitement from the open source community. So yeah, really looking forward to all of that.
Amazing. Mike, thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and congratulations again for both the acquisition and the launch of ClickStack as a holistic stack with a ClickHouse that looks very, very exciting. And as someone who's already marked ClickHouse potential for observability, seeing that potential fulfilled or being taken to the next level as a holistic stack, that's really exciting to see for our open observability community. So keep up the good work to all the team. And yeah, follow them. Obviously, all the references, the Mike's links, and the LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot will be on the show notes. So check them out on your favorite podcast app. And also references, the links that I mentioned to the event recording, so you can check out the open house event recordings and the project GitHub repo, all of that. Again, check out the show notes. With that, I'd like to thank also our guests for being with us today. As always, all the episodes are on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. Check them out. Some of the episodes are being also live streamed, so do follow us on Twitter or Blue Sky or LinkedIn to get the live stream times, and also chime in with follow-up questions and with your comments and insights on the topics. In terms of news, we had last episode was about Open Source Summit North America, and we're heading up straight to Open Source Summit Europe that is taking place end of August, last week of August in Amsterdam this year. So you'll get that hot off the press, and hope to see you there. I'll be there. Mike, are you going to be at the Open Source Summit Europe?
Unfortunately not, but I will be in KubeCon India, I believe, next month as well. So that'll be exciting.
That's another one. And will you have someone from ClickHouse that they can look them up? If you can,
yeah, we'll be there. It'll be me, one of our teammates, some folks from ClickHouse as well. So we'll be there. Really excited to see everyone who'll be there.
Yeah, so follow this up and check out the team as well there. And until next month's episode, thank you very much for listening, and may the open source be with you.